Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. It's Way T Lightheart from Bioptimizers with another episode of the Awesome Health Podcast. And today we're taking a different turn and something that's very close to my heart. And everybody is going to experience that. And we're going to talk about something that a lot of people don't talk about, and that's called grief. And we have for you an expert today who suggests that grief is an invitation to transformation. So our guest today is Jasmin Jenkins, and she is an integrative grief guide and the founder of Fall Up, a community created to support people navigating the spectrum of grief. This is an unavoidable thing as humans. In her work, she brings her clients into the invitations with their grief journeys. Jasmin believes that healing is a co-creative process, and it is her deepest joy to support each person she works with welcoming grief as a profound invitation to transformation. And this is a very interesting concept that I think is something, if you're feeling some grief, we're going to dive into a little bit more. So Jasmin Jenkins, her unique path of service is as an integrative grief guide. She was ushered into existence through 2 decades devoted to personal healing and transformation following the loss of both her mother and brother. This journey of transforming her grief, coupled with a deep desire to help others, gave Jasmin a resounding clarity that her calling was to serve others in healing their grief. Beautiful to take tragedy and turn it into triumph, as well as supporting others. I can relate to that when the loss of my sister back in the day, which set up so many things in my life. Jasmin offers support circles for those seeking a community based on integration and shared experiences, a space for being there for each other within the journey of healing. Fall Up is currently offering only virtual circles for those who know grieving alone can only take them so far. So bottom line is, we're going to talk about a lot of things and some frameworks. Jasmin, welcome to the Awesome Health Podcast.
Thank you, Wade, so much for having me and honoring your sister with you. Thank you for sharing about that with me. I share this a lot, but it bears repeating. I really believe that shared grief is shared courage. Anytime we share about our grief, we're inviting people to expand in our heart space and courage. So thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here.
Yeah. And, I get asked about this a lot, and we're going to get into your story in a second, but for listeners and, as a human, the people that you love the most ultimately is the ones that you're going to experience the most grief with. That's the kind of agreement that you have when you have, whether that's a sibling, whether that's a parent, or whether that's a partner or a child. One of you in that relationship is going to experience the loss either through separation of some sort or through death. And sometimes these can be very tragic and difficult circumstances. In my own life, I watched my sister go through 4 years of cancer treatment and go from a high performance athlete and wasting away. And then the fights and the tragedy that went with my parents and her and the discussions, and it just completely takes over your life. So grief is not only just the incident, but sometimes it's the process of getting to the incident or what happens after the incident. There could be fighting and for estate taxes and squabbles that come up, and it just becomes even more devastating. There's a lot of or unresolved issues with maybe the person that has passed on or gone through something, or a transformation or a loss of a relationship or whatever it happens to be. Jasmin, can you talk about your own story of grief and how you were able to, maybe you can give the listeners a little background of what happened, what you experienced, and then how you found recovery, and then what led you to become a grief guide? I mean, I've never heard of a grief guide. I mean, that's pretty cool. I think it's something that is so great, and I'm just so grateful that you would come on here and talk about, because I know there's people listening that are suffering right now.
Thank you. Thank you for the question, Wade. And my journey with grief really started when I was 13. It sounds like not so similar to what you experienced with your sister. My mom had cancer, and so we were in and out of remission and recurrence for a couple of years. And then my mom did die when I was 15. And, as a 15-year-old, I didn't have the wherewithal to really tune into my emotions. Everything just kind of shut down, and I was concerned about my dad and my brother, and that was kind of that. And then 10 years later, my brother ended his own life, and that really woke me up and brought me into a place of awakening, and really in the place of pain that I didn't at 15 have the wherewithal to acknowledge or to even know how to go into. But yeah, my brother's death was really, it opened me to the path that I entered onto 11 years ago, intentionally healing myself and ultimately arriving at the place where I am now, serving people in their grief journeys and the healing of their grief journeys. And, you know, callings, we don't choose our callings. I think callings choose us. And I never would have imagined 11 years ago when I first really entered into a place of intentional healing that I would be holding space for so many different aspects of grief, but I do it with such gratitude. And I think it's really one of the deepest honors to have another person let you into their grief journey. But to fully answer your question, when I arrived at the place where I no longer felt burdened by my grief, that's when kind of the light bulb went off. Like, okay, you're no longer kind of beholden to this energy, and this has been lifted for you, and it's time to support others in alchemizing the energy of grief, because the etymology of grief traces back to the word burden. And that is so much of what we carry. We carry our grief like a burden, and there aren't really a lot of safe places to open up in the way that we need to open up in order to heal. So yeah, this is really the healer's path. I'm an integrative grief guide because grief is part of the whole. It's not meant to be outside of or pushed down. It's meant to bring us into presence with life. And, you know, we don't really fully learn from something unless we integrate with it. And that's what I do. And that's how I support my clients and my community.
I want to go back in time, because if I look at my own journey, it probably took me about a decade to fully feel the impact of what transpired with my sister's death, and even the process of leading up. And I had deep conversations with her as a teenager, especially after she got terminal, and we knew that the end was coming and what that was like. And so that was at a very formative part of my life, which changed my perception of life and changed my risk averseness. So I took a lot more chances in life and experienced a lot more things in life because of that, and ended up in a field where I was able to help. And now I serve actually as someone who assists with the American Anti-Cancer Institute, which is really great, helping people in their journey, either through the recovery or post recovery, or even to preventative components. And it's been a great thing. And I often reflect, and I bring her up so many times, because had I not gone through that horrific situation, my life and my contribution in the world might look a lot different today. The question that I have is, and for me, I drove into my sport, I drove into training, I drove into nutrition, I went into exercise science, subconsciously, I believe, trying to avoid the same fate for myself. What would you say was the difference between maybe what happened to you when you lost your mother relative to your brother? And was there a correlation between the two events, or was there some other thing? I'd like to kind of dive into that, because a lot of people just suppress that stuff and push it away. And then other people only feel that they can stay connected to the loved ones that have passed on, for example, or left, through the emotion of grief. That they feel if they give up their grief, they lose the connection. So what have you been able to discover in your own journey, and then how you've applied it in your work?
I'm so glad that you spoke to that, Wade. That is such a theme that I witness and observe, is the fear of, well, if I really go into this, then I'm going to lose all of the connection, in terms of the grief, as people staying stuck in their grief because they're afraid of another loss. So really the illuminating moment for me came when I was in Boston with my late brother's fiance at the time, and we had gone there to really clear out where he had been living. And a woman, one of his neighbors, he was newly in the space, but she came down the street kind of up in arms and almost to caution me and his fiance, like, you don't need to do this. You don't need to get rid of everything so quickly. I lost my daughter, 20 something years ago, and I've never changed anything in her room. Like, it's still the same. And I want you to know that if you want to do that, you can do that. And it, hearing her and witnessing her broke my heart in such a real way. And I kind of made a promise to myself that I wouldn't ever relate to my grief in that way. And I felt like that's kind of what I did with my mom, not intentionally, but I was so shut down and I didn't know how to go into the feelings. And then my brother's death, because, as anybody who's experienced a sudden death, it's traumatic. And it shook me up and it shook me back into life and the knowing that I couldn't do it alone. So it was the asking for help that really catalyzed me onto the healing journey that I mentioned earlier, and that I will always be on. I will always be on a healing journey. And that's, I don't think that we are, until we're done with our earthly assignments, we're hopefully healing through something. But I think the greatest differentiator, Wade, is that after losing my brother and seeing that woman and meeting her and feeling that compassion for her, I was able to bring that to myself, that compassion to myself, to know that the 15-year-old girl in me who didn't get that presence and care that I was able to give myself at 25 through encouragement and love for my dad as well. That is what really allowed the experiences, to this particular experience of losing my brother, to bring me into healing in such a way that I can now serve others and hold space for, the full spectrum of grief. Because there's the grief that comes, as you know, with your sister, the profound grief that comes with death. And then there's also the everyday grief of unmet expectations and transitions that we've all been navigating, especially since COVID hit in March.
Really, really great. What were some of the things that you did maybe around your mother's death that you decided that you would do differently around your brother? So if you could compare those two things, because one, you said you kind of suppressed, and then the other one said, I'm not going to do that again. I'm going to find a different way. So what were some of the common elements that you can relate to that other people say, yeah, I've done that? You know what I mean? Like, I know in my own case, just to be transparent, there was part of me that I believe that felt, well, how come she died and I didn't? How come she got so sick and I didn't? And, some of the conversations I had with my sister at the time were hard, that she felt that she got the raw end of the deal. And there was a certain, here we are, the same parents, same life, same everything. And I have robust health and she dies at the age of 22. It isn't fair. And I wrote that she died my last year, or she was in the last few months when I graduated from high school going to university. And I looked back at my yearbook and I wrote, life is not fair, so neither am I. I really felt that emotionally. And I didn't realize how much it was influencing my life at the time. Looking back now, I don't see that as the case at all, but that was how I was able to interpret it with my 18-year-old self with no skills and no connection and nobody to talk to really and no way to unpack that. What were the things that you, looking backwards, you probably did that you would do differently today?
Well, after my mom died, I was very much in a place of, my brother had mental health struggles. So I was very concerned with, is he okay? Was
he older or younger?
We were just a year apart. So he was a year younger than I was. Okay. And my dad, like many widows, is navigating his journey with sadness and sorrow. And, So I was very preoccupied with both of them at 15 and, wondering about things. I wasn't really wondering about what boy liked me at school, but I was more worried about like, is he going to eat, dinner and take care of himself? And is my brother going to pass out in the garage with his friends or whatever, so it was I was very concerned with, my immediate family members instead of being concerned with myself and taking care of myself. And this is such a theme for people that have, that are already caretakers in family systems, that they end up taking care of the people around themselves instead of, oh, wait a minute, in order to heal, I need to pause, breathe, and feel and bring the energy back into my heart space. So that was, I give myself grace at 15. I didn't know how to do that. But I am profoundly grateful that at 25, I was able to seek the healing that I really needed to bring me into a place of peace and acceptance, which I'm sure you're familiar with the stages of grief, and acceptance is ultimately the last stage.
Can you share those? Can you share those with our listeners right now? The stages?
Yeah, sure. So denial, which I think you spoke to a little bit, just like being in that place of denial when we have a diagnosis. Is this or is this not going to be what we think it might be? Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And I mean, surprise, you don't go through them in a linear fashion. Sometimes depression will come and then other times you may feel anger, and one day you may wake up feeling completely in acceptance, and then you have a trigger later in that day and it reminds you, I've got a little bit more presence to bring to this pain.
Right.
So
right.
Yeah, those are the stages. And Claire Bidwell Smith wrote a beautiful book about anxiety, the missing stage of grief, that I think is really important, because so many of us who've experienced particularly profound grief, we're in that place of waiting for the next shoe to drop, and we don't realize, oh, this is anxiety. And that's
so true. This
is anxiety.
True.
Yeah.
Is this
when
happening
is the
to
next
me?
phone call?
When's the next person? The phone rings. You're like, oh no, is it something bad news? Whatever that happens to be. There is a real period of that.
Yeah. And so really acknowledging and then bringing love and kindness to the anxiety and like a sense of friendliness. And like I named my anxiety, and it's like when you can connect in that way, it helps to disempower the intensity of the emotion. So
like identifying, oh, it's negative Nancy that came in or whatever, like whatever. I mean, that might be the bad term to use, but it's an associative person or item or concept that you use to kind of be able to look at that feeling. Is that what you're really saying?
Yeah. Ultimately it's personifying that emotional experience, which is anxiety, which really is a part of grief. And it's the anxiety anxiety, as I'm sure it's future, it's not present. But we have to counter it with a friendliness and a curiosity of, okay, what is it that I'm afraid of right now? And how can I bring love to myself and gentleness to myself in this fear? Like I was terrified for years after my brother died that any phone call I didn't know, it wasn't registered in my phone as a contact. I thought for sure it was a phone call that was going to tell me that's, somebody that I loved had died. So, and I know this is very common, which is why I'm speaking to it, to help normalize this particular anxiety, in the grief that is specific to sudden and tragic loss.
It's very interesting. I'm a big student of Dr. David Hawkins and his map of consciousness, and he talks about the lower energy fields and grief as being down at the low, but there's grief unaddressed can move into, apathy and these very kind of almost catatonic states that, can be even more destructive than the grief itself. People think that grief's the bottom. It's not necessarily the bottom. You can go below that. as a response mechanism, right? Almost like a hopelessness state, especially in extreme travesty or inability. What are some of the things that you notice in your work in around coping mechanisms that people engage that may not be fruitful, so that they might be able to say, hey, I'm doing that?
Well, I think in what we just were speaking about, anxiety, the unhealthy coping mechanism of obsessive thinking and obsessively trying to plan grief out of re-entering your life is a coping mechanism that I observe consistently. And, a theme is, unfortunately, that I observe, but this is true for everyone, wherever you are, the coping mechanism of avoiding the pain and forgetting that there's medicine in the pain, and truly that there's medicine in the pain. And I really believe, and I'm so glad that you brought up the lower states of energy, because you're exactly right. Like, when we don't feel through our grief and we don't literally drink the medicine of our emotions, we become catatonic, and we are asleep to this beautiful experience that we can in turn be awake to. And that's where disease comes in and so many other things. So I think the biggest thing is witnessing people trying to plan grief out of your life instead of being gentle with the grief that you already have, and knowing that it is going to come in and that you can breathe through whatever comes up. And also acknowledging that, when we feel through our feelings, that is how we get to experience healing and grief. And so many people avoid because they're afraid of the deep end, when really the deep end is how we get to rise again.
Perfect. I think it was the Buddha said that, old age, sickness, and death, poverty, all these suffering was concordant with living life. There was no way of avoiding it. And the goal was to find meaning out of the suffering, or meaning from the grief. And I was able to do that over a considerable amount of work, and being able to, dance with the inconvenient truth that for all of us, life is a very short and journey that often ends sooner than we hoped or sooner than we wanted. What are some of the things that you did to kind of unplug from this, or not really unplug, I guess would be amplify your awareness? Because I believe that pain is not necessarily something to be avoided. It is a heightened sense of awareness. And in that heightened sense of awareness, I think in the West, we don't develop an honesty, because we're so addicted to comfort with pain, and to actually leverage pain in a way that increases our awareness about ourselves, about other people. And it can be a great cultivation of empathy. What were some of the things that you did, particularly with your brother, and that you did differently, or some things that maybe you tried that didn't work, or some things that did in that journey?
And now for a Bioptimizers fixed digestion tip: rapid cheat meal relief. Research shows that cheat meals can actually be an effective way to boost your metabolism. One key weight loss hormone, leptin, can be increased by up to 30% following a cheat meal. The challenge with the cheat meals is that all those extra calories and lower food quality can be hard to digest, which means you could be totally sidelined with a food coma after big cheat meals. The solution is to take strong digestive enzymes like masszymes, which will help rapidly digest and break down the extra food. 3 to 5 capsules before or right after your cheat meal can make a huge difference in how you feel following the cheat meal. If it's a cheat day with multiple large meals, you might want to go up to 10 capsules or higher to help you power through all that food. To save 10% on masszymes, go to masszymes.com. That's MASSZYMES.com and enter the code CHEAT10 at checkout.
Sure. So EMDR is a very powerful healing modality, especially for those who have experienced trauma.
What is that?
It's eye movement, desensitization, and reprogramming. So it's a kinesthetic modality, and it's an audio kinesthetic modality. And it ultimately takes you back into the memory. And then in doing that, it is taking the memory out of your somatic body through time.
Wow.
And
Wow.
it's so powerful.
That's really cool. And you went to that shortly afterwards, or?
Yeah, I did my first EMDR session in the fall of 2009, and my brother died in the summer of 2009. So,
oh wow.
Yeah, it was rather soon, but I was ready. Like, I was ready to go in. And plant medicine has been a very powerful ally for me in healing and really getting into the depths.
What types of plant medicine have you leveraged?
A grandmother medicine. So ayahuasca has been very healing for me.
Yeah, I've done that and seen great results with a lot of people. It's under the guidance of the right setting and a teacher.
Yes, that is exactly it. The right setting, the right teacher, and also it's not right. Grandmother medicine is not right for everyone.
Correct.
So I do want to say that. And sassafras and kanna are two other plant medicines that have been very healing for me. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you're familiar with kanna at all, but it's a very powerful heart opener. And that's where the heart of the issue with grief is the heart. So when we can go in with presence into the heart, we can lift out the sadness and anger and sorrow. So those are the three types of plant medicine that have been particularly healing for me.
Yeah, I think there's some extraordinary value in you leveraging these if they're under the guidance of the right person. Unfortunately, in the digital age, there's also some, very pseudo connected, and you really want to have a good background and understanding of psychology and neurochemistry and things like that if you're going to engage in that. So if you're interested in those things, make sure you do your due diligence. These are not recreational chemicals. They're very potent, very powerful, can stir up a lot of stuff. And so people need the right methodology, but they can also be extraordinary tools used in the right environment. So I've used them myself. I think they're great. I didn't have access to them back in the day, so I was able to do it other ways. But then I found deeper aspects of grief that were able to be addressed. And myself and many of my friends and clients also have the same reports. What else do you feel is components that people need to require? Because again, you can have all the techniques or whatever, but there's also support, like being with someone who understands what might be right for you, how to go through the process, how to identify things that you're not paying attention to. And these are probably some of the things that you do, I would believe.
Absolutely. And I really believe that community accelerates healing, with the subtext that all of our stories have medicine for each other. So when I lead healing circles, there may sometimes be a person who's recently lost a pet. And there's also somebody who's lost a parent and somebody who's lost a child. And guess what? They all have medicine for each other. And that's a beautiful thing when we don't compare our grief, because in the same way that, comparison is the thief of joy, comparing our grief is the thief of healing and being present with our grief. It's ultimately the healing circles are really powerful, and to facilitate, I really do everything in partnership with the divine. I'm a willing conduit. But I think that if you're listening and maybe you're in grief and you're feeling like what's a way to accelerate and to start to lift some of this heavier energy, finding a community group is a beautiful way to begin alchemizing your grief.
It's beautiful. Now, I understand that you also lead a lot of these groups and group settings and stuff for transformation, and you've created a set of frameworks, I believe, that you call the 4 invitations of grief. Can you unpack what the 4 invitations are, and then maybe a little bit about these communities and what's involved with that? And then we'll get into some checkpoints that people can do if they're going through a grieving process or a situation has come up and they're experiencing grief. And there's a lot of that going on with COVID, especially around loss of jobs, businesses being closed, all sorts of things. And people are reacting in a variety of different ways. I saw alcoholism's gone up, violence against children has gone up. I've seen bankruptcies go up, business like these, domestic abuse, increase in anxiety drugs being prescribed and used. There's a host of things that people are doing that are very negative in coping with the loss of maybe one's life or with their identity or associations that may or may not come back. Just walk us through that whole thing, and I'd love to hear your feedback.
Yeah, so the 4 invitations it was a spiritual download that I received, and I really asked the divine for a simple, sacred framework through which to support my clients and my communities, because grief can be so messy and so confusing, and it can feel sometimes like which way is up, which way is out. And the invitations are really meant to bring the people that I serve into the truth that grief is ultimately an invitation for both growth and transformation. And when we can think of our grief as an invitation, we can soften into it. So the 4 invitations are really, they can become a mantra. They're meant to serve you wherever you are, on the spectrum of grief. And like you just spoke to, there has been so much grief around unmet expectations this year. The expectation, I'm gonna get my bonus at the end of the year. I'm gonna take this holiday. I'm gonna get married here. So many different things, and a lot of profundity as well. Not that any of those aren't profound, but a lot of death and suffering as well. So the first invitation is the invitation to pause, remembering that the pause is an action step, and pausing and being with our heart is not unproductive. It's not lazy. It's about tuning back into where the healing happens. So the invitation to pause, the invitation to breathe, remembering that our breath is a technology, and it is there to anchor us through whatever emotion that comes up. And it's also there to be leveraged so that we can move through the emotions that are coming up. And really, especially when we're dealing with a grief that's particularly traumatic, the breath usually only goes down so far. So really embracing the invitation to breathe all the way down into your lower abdomen. And then the third invitation is the invitation to feel, which there's such a profound aversion to feeling with grief. This is where people get so stuck and stay so stuck. But when we can remember that feelings are just information about the state of our heart, we can start to enter into a place of healing with them. And then the last invitation is the invitation to heal. So I really believe that all of our grief is as unique as our fingerprint. We can be going through, in a family system, you can be going through the loss of the same person, but you're all going to handle it in a different way. Sure. So permission to be true to your grief, and permission with that being true to find the healing modalities that are in service to what you need to bring in order to return with greater presence to life. So pause, breathe, feel, and heal. You can make it a mantra. You can, those invitations are there for you to soften into the layers within your grief, and to really heal and continue integrating and remembering that grief is a part of the whole of life.
So those 4 things were pause, breathe, feel, and heal?
Yes.
It's a great framework. It's super profound. And I think we witnessed that. Particularly, you'll see a child that may have a disrupt, and they start and they hyperventilate, or they get in the anxiety, and then they start taking those kind of deep breaths, and sometimes they'll cry, and then you have a nice conversation with them, and then they kind of get around, and the next thing you know, they're out running on the soccer field again, and they're fine. And I think children, there's a lot of innate wisdom that happens with the children because it's kind of like an automatic response that they go through. However, as we get to adults or we get into projected ideas of society, we kind of get locked into these models where, well, I'm an adult now. I don't have time to waste. I can't take time. I've got to take care of this. And you know what? Breathing, yeah, that sounds like something cool at yoga. I don't have time to do that. And you know, I remember Jocko Willnick, who I like, he's like, yeah, one of his podcasts is like, someone said about feelings, like, yeah, we don't have feelings around here. You know, a man who's probably faced unconceivable levels of grief, and then the healing process, and that can entail a lot of things. So beautiful. It's really beautiful. It's really, I'm really experiencing that. Talk to me about your work and the groups that you have and the type of people that come to you and how you take them through that process so that they can kind of go through these stages in a systemic way or systematic way and find their own process for healing.
Yeah, I'd love to speak to that. And one thing I just felt called to speak to with respect to what you just shared is the wisdom of children. And they are such profound teachers for us. And one of my new client intake questions is always, do you remember the first time that you felt grief? And then if so, which most people do, how did you handle it? And it's usually tears, some screaming, some expression. And then over time, that's conditioned out of us. So it's part of initiating that internal conversation with healing grief is remembering. Healing is a remembering, and remembering, oh yeah, all of that was healing. So I work with my clients, who I consider to be my co-creators in healing, one-on-one. And I am in service of everyone from people that are going through a divorce to, sibling loss, partner loss, the metaphorical deaths as well as the actual deaths. And, as I've shared with you, my core teaching is that grief is an invitation to growth. So we start from that place, and we're not I am not here to really do a ton of backlog and history. It's really about what is most present and what is the vision that you want to hold for yourself. So it's holding the current grief with the joy, which is really called living. And then with my circles, they're more themed and specific. So supporting motherless daughters, supporting widows, and supporting specific groups of ultimately grievers, people that are transitioning out of an identity, and feeling into the support and the healing that comes when we show up for each other. And I truly believe that it is intention that opens us to transformation. So whether it's one-on-one or circle, everything starts with intention. Because that's how we really get to expand. And then we have that energy of accountability during our session and during the container that we're working together in.
One of the things that I've noticed is that people who go through grief and experiences, tragic experiences, oftentimes develop very deep bonds. And you see this particularly around maybe families that have had connected through a sick family members of similar industry of things. You also see it in large, calamities. If you think of the World Trade Centers coming down and the collective grief that's still shared to this day, 20 years later, and the tying of that. And then also you see it so frequently in military personnel who have been subjected to really horrific situations of the darkest aspect of the human condition, if you will, like just wanton murder and violence and things like that. And their friends and coworkers, being often mutilated badly or destroyed and things like that. And these are very traumatic events. beyond the bonding of grief, I'd like you to speak a little bit about that invitation to heal and that transformative aspect that you've been able to find, I've been able to find, that turned that grief into something beautiful or something expansive or something that added a more greater context or richness to life. What would you say is the other side of grief, I think, for people listening? Because I don't want to just paint this kind of dark process that people have to go through. I think there's an invitation there, as you talked about. What is the invitation in the healing side of grief?
Well, to answer your question about what is on the other side, it's gratitude. You know, it's profound, expansive gratitude to get to wake up in the morning, to get to drink clean water, to get to have nourishing food, to get to see a loved one, to get to be alive. So what is on the other side is gratitude, but it's also through holding gratitude, even in our grief, that we can really move into that place with more flow in our grief. And I know that may sound like a paradox, but when we practice gratitude in the midst of deep grief, we get to the other side sooner.
Super great. You know, one of the things I've noticed too is many of the most grateful, happiest people I've met have gone through some of the most extraordinary levels of travesty and grief in their lives. And I always find that a remarkable paradigm that seems on the surface the opposite, but you begin to appreciate each and every day, the simple things in life. And there's so much to be grateful for. And sometimes grief has to remind ourselves of that. I think, is there any other areas that you'd like to kind of touch on in your work that we haven't covered here that you think is really important for people to kind of get access to?
I think, just the other thing that I wanted to share is kind of the extension of gratitude is celebration. So really coming into, celebration is an energy of electricity and really understanding the impermanence of all of this. And so with that, my friend Yelena, who is the founder of this beautiful project called the Confetti Project, we are collaborating on a series of circles called Grief as Celebration Circles, with the intention to really bring those who are present into the invitation that grief brings into our lives to come into presence with celebration and really opening to the fullness instead of shutting down, which is the shadow side of grief, is being in that contracted state. So the Grief as Celebration Circles, I'm very excited about. I think that confetti, I truly believe that confetti can be, confetti is I have some right next to me. I want to throw it. It's a tool that we see it at weddings, you see it at these joyous occasions. And it's also really beautiful to throw it and to honor the transitions in life. And so I'm really excited we have our first circle on Saturday, and we're really excited to be exploring how this paper can bring us into presence with life, which is the greatest teaching of grief, is presence with impermanence, which is life.
Beautifully said. One quick question that came up is, what are some of let's say someone's listening to this and they either are in a very traumatic experience that would invoke grief, or they know somebody. What are the action steps that you feel they need to kind of implement so that they don't develop this kind of suppressive or repressive nature that clouds really the rest of their existence with, horrific effects? What would you say a person should consider?
Such a beautiful and important question. And I think the answer that feels true for me to share is to treat your grief, or to meet your grief like you would a small child. And in other words, with gentleness and with kindness. And of friendliness, instead of treating grief like it is this grim reaper and it has nothing for you. So yeah, treating your grief like you would a small child. I think most of us that are sensitive, feeling kind people, when you see a small child, it kind of like you lower down to their level and you want to say hello, what's your name? What is it you're playing with? And just bringing that sense of tenderness into your grief is what allows us to start to soften into the medicine that's present for us in our grief, which is all within the feeling of it.
That's beautiful. And I understand that if people are going through grief, you have a intake form, you do counseling and things like that. Can you share with people what the process is if they want to work with you or want to reach out to you or find out more about these groups that you organize and things like that?
Sure. So everything is offered through my website, which is wefallup.com. So I believe that the falling apart leads to falling up, the action and of rising through whatever it is that we're navigating in our grief. And you can find information about my integrative grief guidance and my circles on wefallup.com.
Jasmin Jenkins, this is super beautiful in the work that you do. I really want to recognize and honor that. It's such a powerful place that you're holding for people who are going through very difficult times. And I think it's a great example of what's possible. Obviously, the situations that you've endured is certainly something that could paralyze people with grief, and you found meaning, not only meaning for yourself, but a message and a pathway to help others transform that. And if there's ever a better example of how grief can be an invitation to heal, not just for yourself, but for everybody in your sphere, you're a shining example of that. And it's an honor to have you on the podcast.
Thank you so much, Wade. It was an honor to be here with you. And thank you for a beautiful conversation. And again, honoring your sister and her legacy living out through you.
Thank you very much. And for all our listeners at Bioptimizers, look, grief is something that we can't avoid. It's going to happen to us sooner or later. And the sooner that you learn about these things like pause, breathe, feel, and heal, you share this message, share this podcast, and reach out to people and talk about these things that feel uncomfortable to talk about. And you'll find that there is an extraordinary possibility of transformation. And you never know where that might lead. But I can say it will lead you in places that will be able to allow you to cultivate a new level of gratitude and appreciation for life. Jasmine, thank you so much for joining us. And for all our Bioptimizers listeners at the Awesome Health Podcast, there it is. It's grief, how to deal with it, pause, breathe, feel, and heal. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you again on the next episode of the Awesome Health Podcast with Bioptimizers. I'm Wade Lightheart, wishing you and your family the greatest of gratitude and the healing for whatever grief you might be going through. Thank you.
And now for a Bioptimizers fixed digestion tip. Turn cultured foods into superfoods. Raw fermented foods like sauerkraut and low sugar live yogurt can be good for you, but rarely have enough of the right probiotic strains for therapeutic benefit. So here's a way that you can turn them into superfoods. What I do is I get some raw sauerkraut or a healthy yogurt. Ideally, it's grass-fed or coconut-based, and you can empty 3 caps of P3OM into a container and mix it up thoroughly. Leave it at room temperature for a couple of hours before putting it back into the fridge. And what's going to happen is these probiotic levels will be multiplied. In fact, it doubles every 20 minutes. And then what you're going to get is you're going to have a food with strong proteolytic activity. To learn more about P3OM and why its patented strains make it the strongest probiotic available, go to www.bioptimizers.com.
Thank you for listening to the Bioptimizers Awesome Health Podcast. You can find more information at bioptimizers.com.